few weeks ago in Bible study, our lectionary text that Tony read so well, and related stories about Abraham and Sarah were a part of lectures that we watched by Professor Amy Jill Levine. The text refers to them as Abram and Sarah at this point, but I'm going to call them by the names God gives them later as a part of the covenant, Abraham and Sarah, which is what most people know them by. God's call in the lesson is short but complicated. They're being asked to leave friends and a home and go to an unnamed place in exchange for pretty vague promises. But they have faith and pluck enough to go, and it leads to a long and interesting series of events. And all along the way, Abraham and Sarah have their doubts and they make mistakes, but their worthiness to God is never in doubt. And to their credit, Abraham and Sarah follow God even with their doubts and all their warts. In the time that God called them, they were pretty ordinary, living with their dad. That is, until they listen and follow divine commands and prove ordinary Joes and Janes have extraordinary potential if we are willing to listen to God. In our lesson, just answering God's call provides promises and blessings that unfold and continue to unfold throughout history up to today. And since Lent is a time to learn about our faith, I decided to try and summarize Abraham and Sarah's story and help all of us focus and recall them or hear them for the first time. We tend to hear and remember bits and pieces, which can be meaningful, but we often miss some meaning from the whole arc of the story. Most of us may have a sense that Sarah and Abraham were blessed in blessings and founded Judaism, but we rarely stand back and look at the large tapestry of their narrative. And the narrative's very old, some 4,000 years or so. And that's not all that's old. Abraham is 75, and Sarah is 65 when the call is heard. They're senior citizens throughout the story. If there is no other takeaway, their ages suggest there is time enough left for all of us to do as God beckons. And maybe that's one of the points of the long and the toothiness of so many Bible heroes. Past what we may consider our prime, we are still primed to be God's instruments, still able to be blessed and be blessings. We still matter much and are loved by God. In addition to long qualifying to be in AARP, Sarah and Abraham are also childless, which was seen as a curse and a flaw in their culture. And so not only do they make mistakes like all humans, they have marks of age and barrenness against them for much of the story. And if that's not enough, they're not natives to the land God calls them to. God calls them to become alien refugees. And sadly, aliens were looked down on and mistreated by many back then, just as sadly they are by many in our nation today. A continuing thread in the Bible includes aliens being oppressed and God siding against that oppression. What we don't hear from a number of Christian politicians and elite today are the hard and fast commandments, rules, and stories against oppressing aliens. A fundamental lesson in the Bible is to treat aliens very well. The oppression of immigrants going on in America is very, very unbiblical and in direct violation of God's commands. Here's one of the most famous and comprehensive commands, the type I'm talking about. Leviticus 19:33-34 reads, "When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the native born among you. You shall love the alien as yourself." This pro-alien, pro-refugee part of the Bible often surprises folks, but it shouldn't, given that Judaism begins with Abraham and Sarah being called by God to go and be aliens. And they do just that. The lesson begins in Haran, and Sarah and Abraham are half siblings, which was not unusual at the time. And their father, Terah, brought them to Haran with their uncles and a cousin named Lot. And God's called his herd in Haran. And it does result in Abraham, Sarah, and Lot traveling to settle in Canaan. And when a famine strikes, they flee to Egypt. And as they flee, strange, uncomfortable, violent, and sexist things happen. On the way, Abraham tells Sarah they'll need to claim their brother and sister. Abraham insists because husbands were said to own their wives, and he's worried he might be killed to get at Sarah. You see, in the awfulness of the patriarchy, a husband couldn't sell his wife, but a brother could sell his sister. And when they get to Egypt, sure enough, Pharaoh wants Sarah for her beauty, and as planned, they claim to be brother and sister, and Pharaoh pays Abraham for Sarah. And right away, Pharaoh and his family are plagued. And Pharaoh discovers it's because he took Sarah for a wife when she was already married. And to end the curse, Pharaoh exiles Sarah and Abraham, and they head back to Canaan. And they settle in the same area as Lot. And when their flocks outgrow the area, Lot moves to Sodom, and Abraham and Sarah move on the plain of Mamre. And at one point, an army attacks Sodom, and Lot's captured, and Abraham rescues Lot and also captures and returns plundered loot to the king of Sodom, who blesses Abraham. And shortly after, God comes to Abraham in a vision, reminding him of the promised land and the blessings. And this time God identifies the land and promises many descendants, and even foretells the Hebrews' Egyptian enslavement that will occur with the Moses stories centuries later. And the dream makes Sarah and Abraham wonder how God will provide descendants and seed nations through them, since Sarah's long past childbearing age. And they decide Abraham needs to impregnate Sarah's slave Hagar, whose children by law would then become Sarah's. And Hagar has no say about it. And if that's not tragic enough, once Hagar is pregnant, Sarah is jealously mistreats her. And so Hagar runs away into the wilderness, and God meets her there with instructions to return to Sarah. And God informs Hagar she's having a boy, and that she should name him Ishmael. And God also lets her know she'll have many offspring to come. And in response, Hagar names God Elroy, which means he sees me. God saw and cared about an alien female slave abused by God's chosen but flawed people. Hagar matters. She's honored. She's honored to hear God's covenant directly, to experience the first annunciation. You're going to have a child in the Bible. And to be the only person, the only one in the entire Bible who gets to name God. Hagar does as God instructed, and Abraham is 86 when Ishmael is born. And when Ishmael enters adolescence and Abraham is nearly 100, God reveals that circumcision will be the sign of the covenant with his people. And God also reveals Sarah will bear a son, Isaac. And the news that 90-year-old Sarah would have a child made Abraham fall down laughing. And after he got up, and this was no laughing matter, Abraham caused all the males in the household over 8 days old to be circumcised. And the next thing we know, Abraham is resting in the shade of his tent when three figures visit. Abraham and Sarah provide them with hospitality and rest and comfort and food, even though they're strangers. And then it turns out 2 of the visitors are angels, and one of them is God. And God tells Abraham that within a year, Sarah will have a son. And Sarah overhears this and laughs. And God asks why Sarah was laughing and adds, "Is anything too wonderful for God?" And after the feast, Abraham walks with the visitors a short way toward their destination. And on the walk, he learns that Sodom and Gomorrah are at risk of destruction as a consequence of sinful behavior. And the angels are going to go check it out. And Abraham bargains to stop the destruction of at least 10 righteous men can be found there. And when the angels get to Sodom, they receive the opposite of the hospitality that Abraham and Sarah provided. A mob of men sought to violently sexually assault them in a terrible manner used in Bible times to dominate others into submission. And sexual assaults of that type had nothing to do with any type of sexuality. It was a barbaric form of conquering. And Lot rescues the angels from that violence, but the conduct signals the city's people are wicked and inhospitable. The prophet Ezekiel later claimed the wickedness was Sodom had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. And Jesus himself claims in the New Testament that the sin of Sodom was being inhospitable. Sins have consequences. In our lesson, Sodom and Gomorrah go up in flames. Lot's family are allowed to leave, but Lot's wife famously disobeys the provision that they are not to look back. And if that's not enough, Abraham soon openly claims again that Sarah is his sister to ward off being killed when the Philistine king has Sarah brought to court. And God warns the king in a dream that he and his family will die if he touches Sarah because she's married to Abraham. And the king asks Abraham, why did he do this? And Abraham gave the same reason he had in Egypt, to avoid being killed for his wife. And the king gives Sarah back, and he also gives Abraham riches and lets him settle anywhere he wants in Philistine. Abraham prays for the king's household and they're cured of the curse. And after that strange set of events, Sarah finally gives birth to a son, Isaac. And when Isaac is weaned, birthright issues with Ishmael, his half-brother, cause conflict and trouble. And reportedly God, under the old polytheistic name Elohim, okayed Sarah and Abraham cruelly leaving Hagar and Ishmael in the desert with just a bag of water and bread. And Hagar and Ishmael wandered until the water was gone. And as they prepared to die, an angel appears and provides water and portends that Ishmael will be a great nation. And sure enough, they survive to fulfill God's promises. And after the horrid conduct by Abraham and Sarah, their story begins to come to an end with one more strange and terrible story. God, again, under the old polytheistic name Elohim, commands Abraham to literally sacrifice his son Isaac. And Abraham takes Isaac to a mountain to make a burnt offering. And when Isaac asks about the sacrificial animal, Abraham told him God will provide a lamb for the offering. And before there can be a sacrifice of Isaac, God, this time, under the monotheistic name Yahweh, tells Abraham not to hurt Isaac and provides a lamb for the offering, just as Abraham had predicted. And this part of Abraham's story is often read to be about obedience to God, regardless of the morality of the command. And I find that a terrible reading, not in line at all with Yahweh as a loving God. And I've mentioned before that there is another way to read it. We can understand it as Abraham disrupting the ancient Near East polytheistic God's call for human sacrifices of sons in the time of crisis. Abraham alters this awful practice by listening to Yahweh, the monotheistic God of all, who desires the well-being of all, and ends human sacrifice. And after Isaac and Abraham sacrifice the lamb, they come off the mountain and they go to Beersheba. And as the story closes, Sarah dies first, and she's buried in the cave of the patriarchs. And believe it or not, Abraham remarries and has 6 more children with a second wife, Keturah. And he lives long enough to also see Isaac marry Rebekah and to see his grandchildren, Jacob and Esau. Abraham's 175 when he dies, and his sons Ishmael and Isaac bury him with Sarah. So in this rather quick recounting of the big picture of Abraham and Sarah's narrative, we can hear it's full of ups and downs and good and bad and questionable behavior by Abraham and Sarah, and even by the God imagined by humans in the story. We discover the good news that ordinary people are God's chosen and called, and that God calls and sides with those any culture looks down upon and oppresses. And not only that, God does not give up on or uncall or unlove people who listen, even when they make mistakes. God soaks all of Abraham and Sarah's life and the story which for 4,000 years calls listeners to side with the oppressed and the abused. For every badness in the story, we want goodness. For every goodness, we cheer. We want elderly Sarah and Abraham to have well-being. We want Hagar and Ishmael to have well-being. We even want the kings and their families to have well-being. We want visitors to be treated with hospitality, and violence and inhospitable conduct to stop, and consequences for bad and good conduct, and chances for redemption and salvation. We want humans rescued from harm, and we long for a God who wants that well-being. And every step of the way, no matter who is causing harm, God can be heard in one form or another to step in and re-aim humans who are willing to listen toward well-being. That's shalom. That's peace. The overall arc of this narrative is that each person who listens and follows God's call is led toward their own well-being and the well-being of others. This is a story of a God who is there to lead every listening Joe and Jane to well-being, to shalom, to peace. And that's why the story has been around for 4,000 years. That's why it is foundational to 3 world religions. And that's why it matters still. You see, it's a story that says humans are loved by an ever-present God, and that we matter much to God. And not only that, it's a story that teaches well-being of others ought to matter